On the 18th of January 1815, gravediggers inside of Paris's Madeleine Cemetery stumbled across the coffin and remains of a woman who was hated across France. Marie Antoinette was the Queen of France, who would spectacularly fall from grace during the French Revolution, and she was reviled by her population, and she was seen as a woman who had no empathy for the suffering of her people. Whilst the population was starving, Marie was spending huge sums of money on jewellery and items for her own household, and following the execution of her husband, King Louis XVI, there were many questions as to what to do with the Queen. Some revolutionaries advocated sending Marie to exile and sending her abroad, well away from the heart of France's new government and affairs. But other more radical people advocated the Queen losing her head, and these people had their own way, and Marie would be sent to the guillotine, and she would lose her head in one swift blow as a slanted blade fell on her neck. But following her execution, Marie was interred inside of a hastily dug grave, but decades later her body was dug up and exhumed, and her coffin was opened, and what those people who broke into the coffin of the Queen found was remarkable. Join us today as we look at opening the coffin of the guillotined Queen of France, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Marie Antoinette was brought by the National Convention of France to a tribunal on the 14th of October 1793, and she was accused of many shocking and brutal charges. The courtroom was a farce, and it was decided already that she would die, and many people thought that the verdict was already predetermined. Her lawyers were not allowed to prepare a sufficient defence for her, such was the haste, as the former Queen was taken from her prison cell, and she was accused of some of the most serious crimes. These even included incest, as her own son had been turned against her and accused her of this shocking charge, but Marie was accused of also depleting the national treasury and handing over a lot of money to Austria, her homeland, and she was also said to have been involved in plotting large-scale massacres. It was a short trial, and 2 days later on the 16th of October she would be found guilty of 3 major charges, which were high treason against the French people, depleting the national treasury to a huge extent, negatively affecting the finances of the French, and also conspiracy against the security of the state, linked to foreign powers declaring war on the nation. But Marie's lawyers, despite this, were shocked that she would be sentenced to death, and they thought she would be handed back over to the Austrians and barred from ever coming back to France. But when the death sentence was passed, there was an audible gasp in the courtroom. But to prepare her for her execution, Marie was then sent back briefly to her prison, which was regarded as the antechamber to the guillotine. She would later then be summoned to go to her death. To prepare, Marie Antoinette, the former queen, had her hair roughly cut short, to make sure when the guillotine blade fell that her hair did not snag in the blade, and to allow a cut straight through her neck. Also, she was forced to undress in front of her guards and wear a white dress to her execution, despite the fact she wanted to wear black, almost as if she was in mourning for herself and for France. But the cart then arrived to pick her up, and the guards attached a lead to her neck, as if they were walking a dog, and then the cart, containing the former queen and her priest and confidant, then processed slowly throughout the streets of Paris. Its final destination was the Place de la Révolution, and the same guillotine and execution site where Marie's husband would lose his head months before. The people of Paris could not believe what they were seeing, the former queen on the back of the cart, slowly moving to her death in the procession of the dead, and many shouted abuse and jeered at her, and some also threw objects towards the queen. But those who saw her would note how she seemed solemn and almost in a trance, and it's believed that she would welcome her execution, as she had a very rough few months, and she knew that her end was coming. She would not speak to the priest with her, and just remained in quiet. But at 12:15 p.m, the Queen of France got to the scaffold, and she was helped out of the cart, was then taken up the stairs of the scaffold where the guillotine stood on top of. Her final words were recorded as, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose," as she stood on the foot of the executioner when she was making her way up onto the guillotine. Certainly this was not the iconic word she would have hoped to be remembered for. But then the executioner, who was very experienced, placed a wooden board in front of Marie, and she was then secured to it, before the former Queen of France was lowered onto the guillotine, and was then slid under the sharp slanted blade. This was an execution device advocated by her own husband, and it's believed that Louis XVI decided upon using the slanted blade rather than the crescent one, and he passed a law that saw this efficient device being used in his kingdom. But it would take the head off his wife and him. The executioner made the final checks, and then with a push of the lever, the blade fell and directly sliced through Marie's neck, and her head was taken off in one swift and sharp blow. The executioner then picked up Marie Antoinette's head, and some images even show him parading it above the crowd on a pike. But following the execution, the former queen's remains were collected up. They were then placed inside of a coffin. Her head was also kept with her, which was then taken to the Madeleine Cemetery nearby, and the convention ordered that she, like her husband, should be buried in an unmarked grave, with nothing that highlighted her importance. Madame Tussaud would take a death mask off her face during a break whilst the gravediggers were talking and having lunch, and this would then be later used to create waxwork heads of the executed queen. Madame Tussaud would do this to stay on the right side of the revolutionaries. However, in the decades following her execution, there was a slight restoration of the monarchy, but many people knew where Marie was buried. There were maps drawn up of the rough spot, and also locals gave tours to tourists and foreign dignitaries who wanted to pay their respects to the executed King and Queen of France. But in 1814, King Louis XVIII ordered an investigation into where the remains were, and also what the possibility was of Marie Antoinette's remains being dug up, then reinterred in the royal mausoleum inside the Basilica of Saint-Denis. Marie Antoinette's remains were found around the 18th of January 1815, and her husband's were found shortly after. When the gravediggers broke the soil in the Madeleine Cemetery, they found the right spot, and they found the coffin of Marie, and they discovered that a layer of quicklime had been thrown on top of the coffin to dissolve her remains quicker, but this had solidified and had not worked properly, meaning the former Queen of France's remains were preserved well compared to others. On her remains they found the stockings that she had been forced to wear in prison, and these confirmed her identity, as they were the same ones as other prisoners were given in the prison, and the discovery also said that the woman had lost her head at the foot of a sharp instrument that performed a very sharp and clean cut, as a guillotine would. On the skull of the Queen, which had been found at her feet in an act of disgrace, was also some hair that remained on her head. But after this, the people who made the discovery would place the remains of the former Queen and any other goods found in the coffin inside of 2 chests, and then preparations began to bury her in a royal burial site. Around the grave, there were people who were crying and were praying heavily, and some even fainted as Marie Antoinette's bones were dug up. Then a huge ceremony took place to inter King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette inside the Basilica of Saint-Denis. In this there was a lot of pomp and ceremony, including musicians who would play as the bones were lowered into the tomb. Still today the remains of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are laid to rest where they were reburied, and they remain controversial figures. In the last few decades, many historians have took a more sympathetic approach to the life of Marie Antoinette, and her execution was one which was considered more of a propaganda victory for the revolutionaries than one of grand importance. Marie was at the time a defeated woman who had witnessed her husband butchered and her children treated terribly, and she should probably have been sent to Austria or been forced to live in exile with the rest of the royal family. But her execution had a profound effect on monarchs all around Europe, as these kings and queens began to fear rebellion in their own lands. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.